For more than 30 years, the Appraisal Foundation has been at the forefront of preserving the public trust in the valuation profession, promoting professional excellence, establishing and elevating appraisal standards and appraiser qualifications, and bringing stakeholders together to discuss and debate the pressing issues impacting appraisals, valuations, and the profession itself. In fact, the creation of the Appraisal Foundation in 1987 was a collective action of appraisal associations coming together to reform and strengthen a professional appraisal practice where public trust had eroded. The Appraisal Foundation is unique in that it is not a membership-based advocacy association, but rather it represents the broad-based coalition of appraisal professionals, government regulators, and users of appraisal services, both for-profit and nonprofit. Indeed, the Appraisal Foundation in so many ways reflects the entire profession itself. Today, because of the dedicated efforts of the Appraisal Foundation, government regulators, users of appraisal services, appraisal associations, and of course, appraisers, the appraisal regulatory system is so regarded that it is now deeply embedded within the legal and economic framework of the United States. And there is good reason for this. The appraisal regulatory system underpins the greatest economy in the world, and it protects consumers. Most importantly, the appraisal profession today has won the hard-earned trust of the public. The Appraisal Foundation has earned that trust in several ways. First, through the work of its independent boards, the Appraisal Standards Board and the Appraiser Qualifications Board. Our Appraisal Standards Board establishes, updates, and promotes the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP, which are congressionally authorized standards for real property appraisers and the generally recognized standards for personal property and business valuers. The Appraiser Qualifications Board establishes the minimum qualification criteria for state credentialing and recertification of real property appraisers. Second, the Foundation also leverages its unique position by bringing together nonprofit organizations that serve appraisers as well as nonprofit organizations primarily serving the users of appraisal services. Because the regulatory system is at the core of the profession, the Appraisal Foundation works closely with the Appraisal Subcommittee at the federal level, as well as the appraiser regulatory agencies at the state level. This cooperation helps to ensure that faulty and fraudulent appraisal practices are prevented, which, if left unfettered, could have catastrophic financial ramifications. As we look to the future, the Appraisal Foundation will continue to raise the bar for professional excellence, strive for greater consistency and unity, and pioneer technological innovation for appraisers and those who benefit from appraisal services. Without question, in a dramatically shifting economy, gaining the public trust is never a given. It must be continually earned with every standard, criteria, and guidance. You can play a role in shaping the future of the appraisal profession by getting involved with the Appraisal Foundation. Don't wait, the time is now. Please visit the Appraisal Foundation website for more information.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today on our webinar. Today we have the Vice Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board, Michelle Chkalski-Bradley, and she will be summarizing some areas that the Appraisal Standards Board is exploring for potential changes in USPAP. Michelle, do you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll do the same?
Absolutely. Good afternoon or good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your schedules to attend this webinar. As Lisa said, I am Michelle Chkalski-Bradley. I am Vice Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board, sitting in for our esteemed chair, Mr. Wayne Miller, who could not be with us today. I am a certified general appraiser in the southwestern Pennsylvania area, practicing in the real property residential world. I'm an AQB certified USPAP instructor, love presenting and teaching some of my own courses, and I'm third generation in a family business started by my grandmother, and I've trained 4 trainees, so I stay very busy, but I love it.
Michelle, you definitely dedicate a lot of time to the profession, and it is much appreciated. So my name is Lisa Damaris. I'm the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. I've served in that capacity a little over a year now, and prior to that, I was a residential appraisal out in the real world, as they say. Enough for the introductions. Let's get started with the webinar. First, we always like to start with some housekeeping items so you can know what to expect today. The webinar is being recorded, and you should see the recording post to our website on our YouTube channel in less than about 24 hours usually. And time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we will answer some of your questions. But if we don't have time, always make sure and put those questions in the chat box, because we do have a record of those, and the Appraisal Standards Board does receive a copy of every single question that came in. And as needed, we do sometimes reach out to people individually after the webinar. To ask a question, you can move your mouse to the bottom of your screen and a menu will pop up. And one of the options showing says the word chat feature. You can just click on that. Or you can enable that chat feature by using the keyboard shortcut of Alt plus H. And it's not a bad idea to actually keep your chat box open, because we're going to be providing links and other information to you as the webinar progresses. And at the very conclusion of the webinar, a very, very quick and brief survey will pop up, and we hope that you will just take a quick moment to fill it out as it helps us to improve all of our webinars going forward. All right, so the agenda for today, we will be discussing the 3 sections or the 4 sections of the discussion draft. Basically, these are the potential areas of change for the next edition of USPAP. Michelle and I will do our best to explain the areas. Michelle will do the most important part, which is the actual explanation part. And she will be also going through some of the questions that she is asking that you please provide your answers to. These 4 topics are listed on the screen right here. They include one about personal inspection, one about significant appraisal assistance, one about the definition of misleading, and one about some possible changes to the ethics rule. Now, as previously stating, and as time allowing, we usually have time, but it just depends. Michelle will be answering some questions, and then we will conclude with some quick information for you on the next steps that you can take after you listen to the webinar today. But one of the exciting things I want to point out is we have a new commenting format, a new way for you to get your comments to us. If you have already opened up and viewed the discussion draft that we are discussing here today, you might have noticed that in addition to the traditional way that we have been receiving comments in the past, which has basically just been via email, you just email those to us, we have added alternative ways for you to get your comments to us. So you can now click on a link and it gives you several options. You can attach your comments, meaning like you can attach a Word document or a PDF, or you can just type your comments right in there for the overall discussion draft. Or you can go through and you can answer each question directly right there in the discussion draft. So please tell us what you think. Tell us if this format is helpful or whatever, see if it saves you time. All of your feedback is appreciated. We have noticed already quite a bit of an uptick in the number of responses we've been receiving, so we're kind of excited about this format. Okay, Michelle, can you tell us a bit about the background on this discussion draft so that we can begin here today?
Absolutely, Lisa. Thank you so much. I would like to emphasize a few things before we get started. So first, folks, this is a discussion draft, not an exposure draft. Most people are used to reading a discussion draft, and that's typically what the board has already completed research on and is sending out for comments and feedback. This instead is a discussion draft. We're going to ask several questions and we want to know your feedback. The discussion draft includes some of the biggest and most complex issues that the board is working on and items that are under consideration. The board did note on the first page of the discussion draft that this is not all of the issues that may come up in a future exposure draft. And one other very important thing that I would like to note for everyone is that you'll notice that this discussion draft includes a date. Specifically, it says on the cover, 2023 USPAP. This singular date is only listed to emphasize when the next edition of USPAP will become effective. The ASB has not yet determined the full effective dates for the next edition. Any future promulgation of USPAP will be based upon the needs of the marketplace. So don't read into that 2023 date.
Great, that helps, Michelle, for that explanation. So let's go ahead and let's look at the first section, which is the review of requirements about disclosing a personal inspection, which if you are following along, it's on page 4 of the discussion draft. So Michelle, can you tell us why the board is looking into this topic around personal inspection?
Yes, Lisa, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. The main question the board is seeking feedback from you, the stakeholders, those of you that are listening in this particular section of the discussion draft, is about that certification statement that says, I have or have not made a personal inspection of the property. The ASB needs to hear from stakeholders as to whether this certification statement still serves a necessary purpose. We're going to get into this real deep, so I need everybody to put their thinking caps on a second. On the slide, you'll see it talks about does the certification statement I have or have not made a personal inspection of the property, does it still serve a necessary purpose? This is what we're studying. Now, some people may not realize that this certification statement has existed in appraisal reports for more than a century. It predates USPAP and has existed in USPAP since the standards were first promulgated, and it has remained unchanged. Now, what does this statement really convey to the client? That is the question. Does saying the appraiser did a personal inspection really convey sufficient information to allow the client to understand what the appraiser actually did or didn't do when they were viewing, inspecting the subject property? This is what we need to hear from you, our stakeholders, all of those that are listening in. We need to know if you believe that this statement, this certification, still serves a necessary purpose or not. Now, there's a lot to get into here, but before we start, it's important to note that USPAP doesn't require any inspection of the subject property. Sometimes we know it's actually impossible to inspect the subject property. For example, it might not exist anymore, might not be built yet, could be a piece of artwork that's in storage somewhere. You have to look at photos or whatnot. Maybe the appraiser is actually not allowed to look at the property because of a very disgruntled tenant. There's a host of reasons why that's in there. So there are all kinds of reasons why an appraiser may not be able to inspect a property. Now, the key concept here, this is what's so imperative, the key concept here. The concept in USPAP has always been not that the property inspection be made, but instead that the appraiser identifies a property's relevant characteristics using any reliable sources of information, and then go gather information about those characteristics so that the appraiser can develop credible assignment results. That is the key. Now, of course, today we know there is so much technology and so many different resources for the appraiser to use to gather this type of information. And the traditional method of personal inspection might not be the main method an appraiser needs to use today. Quick story for you. When I first started appraising, and I'm not going to tell you what year it was. When I first started appraising, I had paper maps. Come on, does anybody remember this? Paper maps. I'd follow along with my finger on the map. I'd highlight the maps. I would stop at a payphone and call my office and see if there were any messages that were important. Have we come such a long way, huh? And so has the way we work in today's world. It's not that way anymore. Technology is already being used in ways that allow an appraiser to view a property virtually. And I'm not just talking about drones. This technology that I'm talking about allows an appraiser to personally capture images, to view online images or videos, to gather sophisticated data from a third party. And while being able to confirm these images of the subject property based upon meta tags and location verification capabilities, telling you it's like James Bond. When I was a kid and I watched these shows, I used to think, oh, that's so incredible, that technology, it's so out in the future. Hey folks, it's today. Today is the future. It's all available today. We're not talking about something that might happen in the future. It's right now. And that is why it is so imperative for the ASB to consider these issues.
Michelle, it's very exciting that to think that we are like James Bond now, how
We're
we've
James
evolved
Bond.
to James Bond. That's pretty exciting. Let's move on here. I appreciate that the board gave in the discussion draft, a very simple but an effective scenario to get us thinking about traditional versus new methods of collecting information. So can you kind of discuss that scenario with us?
Yes, Lisa. So the board wants to bring this to life for people. The board wants to share an example, and the ultimate goal is to get you, the audience that's listening, to get you to think about these topics. So let's look at this scenario. It's on your screen here. I'm going to go ahead and read it. I'll read it quickly. So a real property appraiser is working in their office and viewing a video that includes digital meta-tagged images of a one-unit dwelling with computerized calculations of GLA and the ability for enhanced imagery of all areas of the interior and exterior of the unit and its surrounding location. Now, I want you to think about that scenario for a minute. The board's going to ask is going to ask you today several questions to our stakeholders. That includes all of you listening. The board wants to know what you think about this topic. This is a discussion draft. Again, I said at the beginning, this isn't an exposure draft where we're explaining what our research has resulted in and showing you what the proposed promulgation of USPAP might be. No. This is a discussion draft. We want to engage you, our stakeholders, with some of these questions and get your feedback. We want to know how you would answer some of the questions on the next several slides. So if we could flip over to the next slide. Now, considering that scenario that we just talked about, that scenario where the appraiser is working in their office and viewing all this online, think about this question. Is this inspection superior, equivalent, inferior to the appraiser being physically on site? Why or why not? The board is also asking for feedback on whether a virtual inspection could possibly equate to a personal inspection. Now, considering all the advancements, I see lots of people chiming in already. That's great. Go ahead and chime in. We want your feedback, folks. Considering all these advancements, can the utilization of technology to view the subject remotely be sometimes considered the equivalent of, or even superior to, a personal inspection? These are very weighty concepts, aren't they? This is why the board issued this discussion draft. This is why the board wants to engage you, our stakeholders. And we even have a few more questions for our stakeholders to provide feedback on the next slide, Lisa, if we could go over. Now, here are some of the other questions that have been raised. In the interest of public trust, is it necessary for an appraiser to be at, on, in a property in order to inspect it? Let that sink in for just a moment. It's a really interesting question, especially in light of the current technology that we have today, and in particular, when one considers that the client may already be aware of the scope of work employed by the appraiser. Is anybody being misled? Here's what's very important. Given that there can be a huge range of inspection scenarios, where is the line, folks? Where is the line between an appraiser having made a personal inspection and not having made one? I'm going to give you a few examples for you to think about. Think about this. A real property appraiser views the interior, the first level of a two-story home. The appraiser just walks into the first level and views the interior. Doesn't go up to the second floor, doesn't go to the basement. Has that appraiser made a personal inspection? Now think about what that certification statement says in the reporting standards. Okay, let's give it another example here. What about if an appraiser steps onto the subject site, steps their foot right onto that property, and views the exterior of a home from the front only? The appraiser doesn't walk around the sides or the rear. Has the appraiser made a personal inspection of the exterior? Now, if that's not enough, let me give you one more example. Does the appraiser have to complete a detailed catalog of every square inch of the subject property in order for it to be considered a personal inspection? Sink that into your brain for a second. The question is, where is that line? Where is that line between when the appraiser makes a personal inspection and when the appraiser hasn't made a personal inspection? Now, let's take this back for just a moment, back to the initial question. And remember, this section of the discussion draft asks, is the I have or have not made a personal inspection of the subject property? Is that still relevant? That's what we're asking you. For all those that have taken their time to watch this webinar right now, the board's asking you to ponder these very important and weighty questions. I'm going to even challenge you to discuss it with a few of your colleagues. Discuss it with a few colleagues and provide some feedback to the board. Lisa mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that staff, the amazing staff, have provided a brand new, very simple, very easy way for you to provide feedback to the boards. You can put it on electronically, put your thoughts electronically, and the board does need that feedback. No board can operate in a vacuum. That's very important. It's very timely. Please keep in mind, folks, you don't need to write a college thesis. You don't have to do a research paper. Just a yes or a no, or I love this or I hate this is better than no answer at all. But these are some really weighty topics that are moving us forward into the future. So we really do need some feedback on this. Now, please keep some of that in mind as we go through this next section.
Now, Michelle, I actually think this is a great time for you to go over the USPAP definition of personal inspection.
Oh, Lisa, that's a really good point. Okay. It would be very helpful to take a peek at that. Let me get that. And I'm going to read that personal inspection definition quickly, just in case anyone's not able to see their screen right now. I won't read the comment verbatim, but the definition itself starts with a physical observation performed to assist in identifying relevant property characteristics in evaluation service. That's the box that personal inspection is defined as: a physical observation performed to assist in identifying relevant characteristics of the property. I want to point out some feedback that the board has received on this topic. Now, it has been stated to the board that a personal inspection is the only aspect of the scope of work that is required to be addressed in the certification. Have you ever thought about that? Think about the certification statement in your reporting standard in your discipline. A personal inspection is the only aspect of the scope of work that is required to be addressed in that certification. So now that brings us all the way back to that first question, the theme of this section of the discussion draft. And that is, does the certification statement, I have or have not made a personal inspection of the subject property, does that certification statement still need to be retained in that certification in the interest of public trust?
Well, Michelle, I'm going to tell you that right now our chat box is going crazy with comments. You have
I
done an
see it.
excellent
I
job
love
of telling
it.
them we want their comments. It is just rolling by. So thank you very much, but we'll keep going here. And like I said, from the chat box, I can see that this discussion that you're having here, Michelle, not only raises a lot of questions for the ASB to ask, but they all are answering them right now. So can you please tell us which questions the board is asking of our listeners to respond to?
Absolutely. And let me just take 1 second to say, this is so wonderful to have this discussion draft and have all these hundreds of people on this webinar and sharing immediate feedback. This is phenomenal. Put this in writing as well. Don't be afraid ever to provide a comment to any of the boards. This is what it's all about, folks, discussing. This is great. Okay, so let's get to these questions. The first question that the board is asking, should the certification statement be removed? That is the I have or I have not made a personal inspection of the subject property. Should that be removed? Why or why not? The board wants to know, we're seeking feedback if you feel that it's still a necessary part of the certification. Now, the second question that the board has for you, very important. It's relating to the part of the scope of work disclosure that discusses the disclosure obligations. So, right, we know that the scope of work rule is development related, correct? It's all development related, except that at the very end, there's a disclosure requirement. That's one reporting requirement in that scope of work rule. And what does that disclosure obligation say in the scope of work rule? It says, disclose the scope of work used by the appraiser in the report. Okay, so does that disclosure obligation section in the scope of work rule, which requires the report to contain sufficient information to allow the client and other intended users to understand the scope of work performed, does that disclosure already adequately cover the need for the appraiser to disclose details about the inspection? Folks, in other words, this is key. The board's asking you, does this obligation to disclose the scope of work in the report already cover the need for the report to contain sufficient information about the inspection performed by the appraiser? Tell us, talk to us, tell us if you agree or disagree. It's a big question. This next question, see, we have lots of questions for you. Again, discussion draft, not exposure draft. The next question is a progression from the previous question that we just talked about. If you believe that the disclosure obligation section in the scope of work rule does not already require an appraiser to disclose the type of inspection performed, then should the disclosure obligation section of the scope of work rule be expanded to require it? Require the appraiser to include details about the inspection, such as dates, times, exterior, interior, etc. What are the benefits, possible drawbacks associated with a more thorough disclosure requirement. So that gets us to the last question on the next slide. So looking at that definition of personal inspection, the board is also asking you if the definition of personal inspection is retained, then can utilizing virtual technology be the personal inspection? Given the types of technological advancements that currently exist, could virtual technology be that personal inspection? This question really gets you thinking about that non-traditional technology out there. Does some of this advanced technology meet the definition of personal inspection in USPAP? Why or why not? Now, should this definition remain? Should it be changed? Perhaps maybe a different term other than personal inspection may be more appropriate. This is what we want to hear from you. It's a discussion draft. Let's discuss. Now, again, I challenged you earlier to discuss this with some of your colleagues and provide feedback to the board, so I'm trusting you all.
They're still going crazy, and I just have a feeling you guys are going to have some great information coming out of this. So thank you for that, Michelle. And I know that the arising technology, apps, software, all of that, it really helps everybody in our profession. But by necessity, it seems that you are saying that USPAP must also wrestle with these new questions to continue to be flexible so as not to be a barrier for appraisers and stakeholders, while protecting the public trust. So thank you and the board for continuing to explore these questions on behalf of the stakeholders. Okay, so let's move on to the next section of the discussion draft. This is the section on significant appraisal assistance. You can follow your discussion on page 6 of the discussion draft, and we have the majority of the key points here in this presentation, but if you want the additional narrative, do be sure and open up your discussion draft and go through that PDF. It's impossible to cover all, every detail of the discussion draft here today. Michelle, can you tell us why the board is exploring significant appraisal assistance? I mean,
Absolutely.
Is there confusion out there, or why is this topic being opened up?
Great question. And the answer is yes, there's growing confusion about this particular topic. And I think when you see the question on the screen, you're going to understand why this is becoming more and more of a confusing issue. So the board is exploring this question: is significant real property appraisal assistance understood by appraisers and users of appraisal services? Now I'm going to restate that particular question using another discipline specific example. Is significant personal property appraisal assistance understood by appraisers and users of appraisal services? Always a good reminder to remember that significant appraisal assistance may be part of every discipline. Also, that the reporting standard for each discipline requires the disclosure of the identity of an appraiser, providing this assistance to be in the report certification. And details on the extent of that assistance must be included somewhere within that appraisal report. And of course, this would either be stated or summarized depending on the reporting option used by the appraiser. And this disclosure serves several purposes. It provides information to the client and the intended user that another appraiser or even other appraisers who did not sign a certification still contributed to portions of the assignment in a meaningful way. And secondly, and importantly, when an appraiser is noted as having provided significant appraisal assistance and the nature of that assistance is disclosed within the report, this may assist an appraiser in demonstrating experience towards a state credential or even a professional designation. So as of today, significant appraisal assistance is not currently defined in USPAP. However, that's not to say it's not mentioned. USPAP does have guidance on this topic in the frequently asked questions, specifically FAQ 278. And also guidance related to this is provided in Advisory Opinion 31.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that the board, tries to give examples and scenarios so that all of this can be easily understood. So here we are. Here's another one. Can you lead us through this one?
Yes. So, people have asked, why now? Why is this such a big issue, as you mentioned in the beginning of this section of the discussion draft? Well, it's becoming a huge frequently asked question because of the scenario, as I mentioned. Here on your screen, a client hires 2 real property appraisers. The first one goes out and inspects the property. The second one, unrelated, the second one completes the appraisal assignment. Now, this has created some confusion. And by the way, this scenario is happening every single day. This scenario creates the misconception that the first appraiser, the one that actually went out and looked at the subject property, it creates the misconception that that person has provided significant appraisal assistance, but they're not. They're not providing significant appraisal assistance. All they're doing is inspecting a property and providing details about that property. It is a misconception that that first appraiser provides significant appraisal assistance. So this brings us to a few very, very important key points. Folks, it's up to the signing appraiser to determine whether the contributions of another appraiser rise to the level of significant appraisal assistance. So the board is seeking your input on this question. Is that sufficient? Is that sufficient, or should USPAP more formally define the nature of significant appraisal assistance? What is necessary in the interest to protect the public trust?
Great question. And now is the time for me to watch the chat box light on fire again, because Michelle is going to go through the questions for you. You want to lead us through these?
I would love to lead these questions. Okay, so first, let's jump into these fun questions. It makes everyone put their thinking cap on. Folks, get a piece of paper. Well, you can do it electronically, or get a piece of paper, take a pencil, and just jot down a few notes if you want of things that pop into your head as I'm asking these questions to you, so you can provide them back to the board. This is great feedback. So first, the world, and certainly technology, is changing at such a fast pace, it just makes my head spin. And the board is working so hard to be proactive and think about all these scenarios, with public trust absolutely being at the heart of any potential changes the board is discussing. So the first question, folks, would it be helpful to you for USPAP to formally define this term, significant appraisal assistance, in the definition section? Why or why not? And if you think that it would be very beneficial to define this term, what elements do you think should be in that definition? You may be someone who has a really great argument for why it should be in. Please tell us. You may be someone who has an idea of why it shouldn't be in. Please tell us. This is about sharing thoughts and ideas. It's such a weighty issue, and the board needs you to provide the comment. This is a discussion draft, wink, wink, discuss with us.
Thank you, Michelle. As you know, because you read them, I read them, we get great comment letters. So I bet that someone has an argument for why it should or shouldn't be in there. So do send those in. And maybe there are some unintended consequences that could occur if this phrase were to be defined. So we're looking forward to reading your comments. Okay, so let's look at the questions that the board is asking of you for this section.
Yes, yes. And good time as a reminder, just to remind everyone that the board reads every comment, every letter, every whatever it is that you send, electronic survey, we read it all. Every board member does. It doesn't matter who wrote it, how long or short it is. It doesn't matter if it's a college thesis or not. We don't need the college thesis. We want you to provide your input. We have several more questions. Don't forget that challenge I threw out to you to talk to your colleagues. First question here is the guidance in advisory opinion 31 sufficient? Now, this is the advisory opinion titled Appraisals Involving More Than One Appraiser. It's in your USPAP publication beginning on page 146. This advisory opinion illustrates the specific USPAP obligations when an appraisal or appraisal review assignment involves more than one appraiser, and it applies to all disciplines. Now, there are 7 illustrations provided in this advisory opinion, and it illustrates the USPAP obligations. So we're asking you, if that guidance in AO 31 is not sufficient, what areas of practice do you think require some additional guidance, or what kind of illustrations would be helpful to you? The essence of this question really is more guidance needed? Is anybody confused? Is anybody questioning this? Is more guidance needed? Yes or no? Do you think anyone would benefit from more guidance? Now, how about, should significant appraisal assistance only be something that the signing appraiser controls? Or could it also be something out of their control, such as a property inspection provided by the client that was completed by another appraiser? You may have had some of these experiences. Maybe you thought about this a lot. Maybe you work in the tech field. Maybe you loathe technology. But folks, if there is one thing I have learned in my life, it's that technology is not going away. We have to embrace it. What do you think? Everyone out there listening, just pause for one moment. Think about how you would answer that question and shoot off an email to us. Now, another question. This one follows the previous question. Related to the prior question, is it even appropriate for the signing appraiser to list another appraiser as having provided significant appraisal assistance without the assisting appraiser's permission? Why or why not? So we're exploring these permission questions. Let me restate that. Related to the above, is it even appropriate for the signing appraiser to state that significant appraisal assistance was provided without the other appraiser's permission? Now, don't go to sleep. I got one more question for you. Should there be any additional advice by ASB on what constitutes significant appraisal assistance? I hope you're writing all your ideas down, and don't be afraid to, don't be shy, don't be afraid to provide this information to us.
Great, thanks, Michelle. We hope that the attendees have some answers on these topics. Like I said, I see them going by here, but if you have bigger, lengthier explanations you want to make, be sure and click on those links in the discussion draft and get those over to us. Note that, even a simple yes or no answer is still always better than having no comment at all. Okay, let's move on to the third section here, which is misleading. This is on page 8 of your discussion draft. Michelle, can you tell us why the board is looking into misleading?
Yes, this definition, it's still being explored by the board. Overall, the board is wondering, should this definition of misleading remain as it appears in USPAP today? Should it be removed? Should it be altered? Let me give you a quick background on this term misleading. It was added into the current edition of USPAP for the 2020-2021 edition after public exposure. I'm going to read very quickly the definition to you. Intentionally or unintentionally, misrepresenting, misstating, or concealing relevant facts or conclusions. Now, after this definition was adopted by the board, some stakeholders have noted that the inclusion of the term unintentionally could cause a simple, relatively immaterial typographical error to technically result in a misleading appraisal. And the board has issued a question and answer on this topic, and it does state in part on your screen a minor unintentional mistake, such as a typographical error, does not make a report misleading. Now, although the board did issue this frequently asked question, there is still some concern about this definition remaining in USPAP. This is why the board is still discussing this issue. But here's something very important to think about. And this is real key. The term misleading, and really more specifically, the responsibility to not be misleading, is fundamental to public trust. If this word is so fundamental to public trust and so fundamental to USPAP, should it be defined? Conversely, if the term is not defined in USPAP, then could other entities use their own definition of what they believe misleading to be, which may result in inconsistent application and enforcement? So this is why the board is wrestling with this, and we're looking for some more feedback.
Thanks, Michelle. So, all of these discussions that you're talking about today that have been had in the past have brought these issues to the board, and that's why these questions are being drafted, where they're coming from. Do you want to go into the next for questions?
Would love to. Folks, should misleading remain a defined term? If the board can sort out how to exclude immaterial typos from being considered misleading. Remember, perfection is impossible to attain, and competency doesn't require perfection. So tied to that question, the next question is, should misleading remain a defined term only if the word unintentional were to be removed? As always, the board is always worried about guidance. So on the next question, is additional guidance necessary in the form of an AO, advisory opinion, or an FAQ? And if so, what aspects of the topic might need guidance? What is confusing to people, to stakeholders? Are there examples of unintentional acts or items that could result in a misleading report? And last, we're asking for your assistance in this final question. Since the definition already exists in USPAP, can you provide us with any examples of where this definition might have caused some kind of negative issue that either adversely impacts public trust or has resulted in some type of unintended consequence?
Thank you, Michelle. We have got just a little over 10 minutes left, and luckily we are just approaching our last section, so hopefully we can get that in time. So the board is looking.
We will.
Okay, good. The board is looking into the appraiser conduct section of the ethics rule and the requirements related to different characteristics of people. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Lisa, this is last but certainly not least. We're discussing this extremely important topic, and the board is exploring and wondering, is the requirement for an appraiser to avoid relying upon unsupported conclusions related to demographic characteristics understood? There has been media focus on issues relating to fair housing. However, because appraisal is one part of the greater mortgage lending process, the appraisal body of knowledge, and the appraisal process have become part of this discussion. Now, of course, the ASB does not own or control the general appraisal body of knowledge, and therefore can't establish or amend practices relating to how comparables are selected, for example. However, the conduct section of the ethics rule is absolutely clear. An appraiser must not perform an assignment with bias, period. It further goes on to say an appraiser must not use or rely on unsupported conclusions relating to the protected classes shown on your screen. Now, one should note that these demographic characteristics are protected under fair housing laws and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, also known as ECOA. This section of the ethics rule, by the way, was adopted specifically to match the protections that homeowners, buyers, sellers, renters are afforded under these federal laws to prevent bias and illegal discrimination in housing and fair access to credit.
Michelle, we know that the board has been exploring some proposed changes to Advisory Opinion 16, which addresses this whole issue related to fair housing. You want to tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so earlier this year, the Appraisal Standards Board issued an exposure draft of Advisory Opinion 16. Folks, keep in mind that in real property appraisal assignments in the residential world especially, hey, they're just one part of the greater world of appraising. Advisory Opinion 16 provides guidance on appraising properties that are subject to fair housing laws. And as the board examined the comments received after we released the AO16 exposure draft, two topics have come up that relate to the wording in the ethics rule. First is fairly simple, not very complex and straightforward. The term disability has replaced handicap in many laws and regulations. Very straightforward. However, the second issue is a bit more complex. The board discussed the term unsupported in the ethics rule. And it's important to note that USPAP covers all aspects of the appraisal profession, not just real property, residential mortgage lending, where fair housing and ECOA are applicable. It's also important to think about appraisals are completed for a host of reasons, not just mortgage lending. But there are so many areas in the appraisal world, such as establishment of sales prices, estates, income taxation. So there's so many more ways appraisals are done. It's not just residential mortgage lending. And the board realizes that appraisers valuing property in these other facets outside of residential mortgage lending, of these other facets of the profession may need to consider supported conclusions in demographic categories. And the board listed some examples for the readers to understand. Some of the examples you'll see: a shopping center where the anchor tenant is an ethnic grocery store, or a company that specializes in products that cater to a specific racial or ethnic population. So when we look at USPAP, the underpinnings of the ethics rule still apply. An appraiser must not be biased in their work or provide reports that illegally discriminate. And the board hopes that with very careful adherence to USPAP, that appraisers can provide unbiased, credible, understandable results to clients in these many varied assignment types.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that the board now has some questions for our listeners on AO16, and I bet you can read those to us.
Yes, I can. And again, thinking caps, folks, thinking caps. Are appraisers' obligations under the ethics rule clear to appraisers and stakeholders? And our last question in this discussion draft and in this section is, what, if any, suggestions do you have for revisions to the ethics rule, if any?
Perfect. I think you did it. Thank you, Michelle, for taking us through the discussion draft. We do have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to have a hard time picking questions out of the chat box because they have literally been going by at breakneck speed. So I may just read some comments out loud, depends. I just want to make sure we don't have dead air space. So I'm just going to flip through them.
Absolutely. And you know, Lisa, as you're reading through them to decide some comments, folks, keep in mind, if you did ask a question in the chat box, or if you have any questions, we have record of everything in the chat box, and please know that this will be provided to all of the board members, all of your comments, all of your concerns, all of your support. Everything that you've put in that chat box will be captured and provided to all of the board members, and every part of it will be read.
Thank you. Here's one. I'm kind of summarizing two or three of them together in one. It has to do with a personal inspection and the effective date of the appraisal. So what I'm gathering here is they're talking about, let's say your effective date is from 2 years ago, and last week you went to go look at the property, but the property was burnt down. Is that an instance where a personal inspection may be considered less reliable, less useful, inferior, superior? I'm just getting your take on what they're saying.
So if I understand the question correctly, the appraiser had viewed the property a few years ago. And if they did view the property a few years ago and then it burnt down, you'll still have a copy of that work file, because if it's a few, I'm going to think it's less than 5. So you're going to have a copy of that work file and you're going to have some information about it. It's certainly a discussion between you and your client when that effective date is going to be.
Perfect. So that term unsupported always brings up concerns with people, because I think they jump right from, oh, if we can't do unsupported, that means we can do supported conclusions about something, say age. Is there an instance where that might occur?
Absolutely. There is absolutely the ability to make a supported conclusion within USPAP.
Perfect. I think they're probably referring to the circumstances where the residential appraisers have to appraise properties in those communities that are ages 55 and
55
plus
and older, yes.
and older, and in those circumstances it is not illegal, and that is the point, is that the community is
That
based
is
on
the
age.
point. And that's a really good question. So if that's coming up in the chat box, maybe that's something that we'll take back to the board, and perhaps that needs some more guidance.
Yep. A lot of the questions are on inspections. Okay, significant appraisal assistance. I know in USPAP there is a part of one of our FAQs that says that the property inspection could be significant appraisal assistance. Maybe do you want to comment on the fact that that needs to involve not just facts, but the appraisal process and judgment and analysis,
Yep.
not just, yeah.
Yeah, so significant appraisal assistance, I use this now as I had mentioned, I've trained 4 trainees, and I hope they're all listening right now, by the way. I've trained 4 trainees, and I use significant appraisal assistance in virtually every assignment I have, because I have my trainees coming out in the field with me, and they are providing relevant information. They're helping me identify the relevant characteristics of the property, and I'm walking them through. And they're identified in both the certification statement and the extent of their assistance, remember, must be disclosed somewhere within that appraisal report. So it's not just the acknowledgement and the certification, it's also the requirement to either state or summarize the extent of their assistance within the report as well.
Thank you. And thank you for training all of those people, that new generation coming up.
Hey, everybody needs to train some more people to get into this amazing profession.
I agree. We have come to the end of our webinar here. We have 3 minutes left now. Just give me just enough time to run through some closing comments. Basically, what do you think? Do you have some answers for us? Do you have some input for us? We encourage you to comment in writing to the board before July 23rd. So as Michelle mentioned, you and your colleagues have time to get to go together over coffee, get those comments to us. So please click on the link in the chat box to submit your comments to the ASB. You can always email them to us, asb@appraisalfoundation.org. You can go into the discussion draft and click on the link and fill all that out if you would like. The ASB is going to have its virtual public meeting on October 28th of 2021. So you might want to mark your calendar for that. You can see a registration link there in the chat box, and you can always check out our events page and register for upcoming meetings and webinars. So with that, Michelle, do you have any last words before we sign off here today?
I just want to say thank you so much for your attendance, folks. We are here to listen to what you have to say, so please don't be shy.
Please make sure to fill out a very quick and brief survey that will pop up as we end this webinar. This will allow us to focus specifically on issues for you all. We encourage you to reach out to us with any questions. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Michelle, and we hope to hear from you all.